Hello, and welcome to our lesson on cell energy processes, or what we'll call energy transformations that take place in the cell. So as you see from this slide, what I'm showing you here is a picture of the mitochondria and the chloroplast. And those are the two organelles where these two processes occur. So for the most part, you are going to be asked to do is memorize the chemical formulas or chemical equations for both cellular respiration and photosynthesis. So what I'm going to do is you have a table that looks like this. And for cellular respiration, I have it broken down so that you will be identifying the energy source, an oxidizing agent, which these two things would be the reactants, and then these three things would be the products, an energy product, a waste product, and another waste product. And then we're going to be talking about where each of these different things are used, and then how or where they come, and then where these things are used. And then there'll be some basic questions to fill out. So for example, on this first one, where it says the energy source is food or glucose, and then the oxidizing agent is oxygen, where you write that down on here, like this, where you're going to write it down on our document is here. So the energy source is glucose, and the oxidizing agent is oxygen. And then the questions below that you fill in here. So the first question on there is, where does this come from? For glucose and oxygen, both of these are going to come from plants doing synthesis. The glucose is the main product that is made by photosynthesis, and the plant generally stores it in various locations. So as we eat a plant-based food product, you're going to be getting glucose from that. There's going to be carbohydrates in most of the plant-based food products. Oxygen we get from breathing the air, but the plants are the sole source, or photosynthesis at least, is the sole source of O2 in our atmosphere. So how does the cell get it? Well, glucose is one of those molecules that's a little bit too big to go right through the cell membrane. So there's a specific way that the cell gets it, and that's from absorbing it from the blood through the cell membrane via facilitated diffusion. So it got into the blood through the small intestine, and then from the blood into the cell, it goes through facilitated diffusion. Oxygen gets into your bloodstream much easier. It happens through your lungs, and it only needs simple diffusion to happen. And the reason why is because oxygen is small enough to fit directly through the cell membrane. And your whole respiratory system, it's adapted basically to make sure that oxygen will always get into your bloodstream. Next thing that you'll see in the document is this arrow. And the arrow is representing that a chemical reaction has taken place. And I ask, what other reaction is this similar to? So it's similar to combustion. Combustion is when you take any fuel, like wood, add oxygen to it, and it's going to convert it to carbon dioxide and water. That's what comes off in the smoke. And then heat, as well as light. And you know, when you burn a candle or you burn wood, that's ultimately what's going on. In your body, you do basically the same thing. You take sugar and oxygen and you convert it into carbon dioxide water, but instead of just heat, is a byproduct, but you also produce ATP, which we'll talk about in a second. And then the last part is, what protein is needed to carry this reaction out at lower temperature? So combustion requires temperatures in like the 450 to 500 degree range, whereas our body burns everything at like 98 degrees. Why does that happen? Well, because of enzymes. So what I'm showing here is a sugar is going to come in, and oxygen is going to come in, and then it's going to convert it to CO2 and water. So our products are ATP, and then there's two waste products, CO2 and water. So we go in here and we write in our energy product is ATP, and then our waste products are CO2 and water. And over here, we want to put a plus. So again, this is our main chemical formula, and it might be actually helpful if we highlight it. Because this, again, you are going to need to have it memorized or at least be able to come back and refer to this when you are taking your test, because we're going to assume that you know this formula. All right, and again, we're asking that you fill out the rest of this as we go along. So the question about ATP is, what cell process uses ATP? Well, we learned about a couple, but the main one we learned about is called active transport. And that's really how your brain functions. Anything in your cells that move, those are going to require ATP. So your muscle cells moving, that requires ATP. And then synthesis of cell products, meaning making new things, is going to require ATP. So growing. So your brain functioning, you're growing, and you're moving all take ATP. As for the two waste products, CO2 and water, your cells have to first get rid of it. And in the case of CO2 being released, CO2 is another one that's small enough to fit through the cell membrane. Osmosis is going to be the release of water. And then how does your body get rid of it? Well, you're familiar with how your body gets rid of it. You can, if you take a glass and exhale into the glass, you'll be able to see steam or condensation filling on the side of the glass. And that's from exhaling and excreting the CO2 and water. Does anything use CO2 and water? Sure, plants use these for photosynthesis. We kind of have what's called a carbon and oxygen cycle, and that's what our Your Food and You activity showed, was that both these things kind of work together. All right, down at the bottom, we ask, what's an oxidizing agent? Because that's what we call what oxygen is. So oxygen is an oxidizing agent, and oxygen's job is basically to remove energy. And in this case, the energy that it's removing from glucose is going to be the hydrogen. So what happens is, if you see how I have this color-coded, the water that forms is a result of hydrogen being released from oxygen. And what happens is the cell runs on hydrogen fuel to make ATP. There's a mechanism of making ATP that runs on hydrogen fuel. And then once the hydrogen fuel has been spent, then it gets added to oxygen to make water. So hydrogen fuel can't be spent unless you have oxygen present. And that's what an oxidizing agent does. So oxidizing agent takes energy in the form of hydrogen from other molecules and transfers it to another molecule. So where does this reaction occur in the cell? Well, this is going to happen in the mitochondrion. And before this, we kind of just said the mitochondrion is like a kidney bean shaped thing. But really, when we look at it, it has these little folds in it. And those little folds is a membrane, and it's full of enzymes, specifically enzymes that make ATP, that run on the sugar that we consume. Finally, we want you to sketch ATP. So ATP is a nucleotide. So ATP going to ADP releases energy, and then ADP going to ATP adds energy. So in the process of this, we're going to be making energy. So there's a simplified way to draw it. So I'm just having you draw a shape that we're going to call adenosine. And then there's three phosphate groups. There's a energy that's stored in each of the bonds between the phosphate, but a lot of energy is stored between the last two phosphates. So when that bond gets broken, energy gets released. And energy gets released as a result of the phosphate getting added to another molecule, and then that gives that other molecule the energy. So as it's ATP, there's a lot of energy, but once it's spent by giving up its phosphate, now it has little energy. But the thing that gained the phosphate, that now has a lot of energy. All right, so let's move on to photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is going to be on the next page of this. So again, here's where the chemical formula, and we're going to say there's an energy source, a raw material, and then an energy product and a waste product. So if we go back to here, the energy source is going to be a source of hydrogen. In this case, water is the energy source for photosynthesis. Now, water's energy can't be released unless you have unless you actually have something that can break off that hydrogen. So let's just first talk about where it gets all these things. So water is an energy source, carbon dioxide is a raw material. So water comes from the ground, it's taken up by the roots, and CO2 is taken from the air through to the leaves through those little pores on the bottom called the stomata, which we drew in the cell unit. The cell gets rid of this, or how does the cell get it? So water goes up through osmosis, CO2 goes in through simple diffusion. In order for the hydrogen to come off of the water, you need light, okay? Photo means light. And we'll talk about how that happens in a little bit. But then you have the energy product. So the energy product is the main thing that's made by photosynthesis, and that's going to be a carbohydrate or glucose. And then your waste product is going to be oxygen. So if we go back to here, now we have all the different parts. So we can say our energy source is going to be water. Our raw material is going to be CO2. And then our products over here, you have your energy product is glucose. And then you have your waste product is going to be oxygen. And again, key thing here is that this is going to require sunlight. Okay. And again, this is basically your formula right here of photosynthesis. Okay, so let's go back to here. What does the cell do with carbohydrates? Well, it's going to use it for energy, and it's going to require that it uses respiration to get the energy from it for raw material. But it could also, or for that energy, but it also could be a raw material for growth. So like some of it is going to become cellulose, which is going to make up the cell walls. Usually during the times around here, like when the plant is doing in the summertime, when the light's out much longer and the plant's able to do photosynthesis for a very long time, it's actually going to store extra energy as starch. Oxygen, it's actually going to use some of its own oxygen. So even though we're saying oxygen is a waste product, the plant is going to use oxygen. The plant requires oxygen. That's why we say like earthworms are good for plants, because the roots need to have the ability to get oxygen down to them. So earthworms making all their little tunnels and things like that allows the oxygen to get down into the roots. So oxygen is used by animals and plants for respiration. That's a key thing. A lot of students kind of get confused by the fact that plants are actually doing respiration and also breathing in oxygen. It's just usually during the time in the summer and spring when they're doing a lot of photosynthesis, they're producing more oxygen than we are actually consuming. Most of the oxygen that's produced, all the oxygen that we breathe is produced by photosynthesis. Most of it is produced by algae living in the ocean and then the rainforests. And the reason why is because they're doing their photosynthesis all the time. The plants that are around here, they're not really doing photosynthesis in the winter time. So we really rely on all of the organisms that live near the equator and in the tropics to continuously produce oxygen so that we have it to breathe. So the question was, how does light actually get water's energy? Well, there's a molecule called chlorophyll, and what chlorophyll does is it acts as an oxidizing agent. Once it gathers light, it can break off the hydrogen off of oxygen, or sorry, off of water, releasing the oxygen that's left over, and add it to CO2 to make the carbohydrates. Photosynthesis is going to take place in the chloroplast. And then lastly, do plants carry out respiration? Well, hopefully you got the point that it does carry out respiration. And this little diagram kind of illustrates that. They're performing respiration, but plants aren't super active, so they're not really absorbing a whole lot of oxygen and releasing a whole lot of CO2. Although it should be noted that the plants that are out right now, like the big trees, they're only producing CO2 and absorbing oxygen. They're not producing any oxygen or CO2 because there's no photosynthesis occurring. That's why in the winter time, CO2 levels actually increase compared to the summertime. So do plants carry out respiration? Yes. Photosynthesis only makes the food. Respiration turns it into a usable energy source. The final page has an overall diagram of this process. And this is what how you should fill out this diagram. So I start off with glucose, and what you should hopefully notice by this is that these two products are basically the reverse of each other. The glucose that's produced in photosynthesis is going to be used in respiration. The oxygen that's going to be produced by photosynthesis is used for respiration. Then the CO2 and water that are produced by respiration are going to be used for photosynthesis. And then ATP is going to be your energy source. So that's what you ultimately use. And then there's going to be light as the energy source for chlorophyll. And I've illustrated chlorophyll by filling in this outer ring in green, because that's basically what is causing the chloroplast to be green. So if we summarize this, cell respiration is energy released from sugar to make ATP. Photosynthesis is going to be energy from the sun stored as the sugar. Okay. To note, remember that the sun can also be referred to as solar energy. And then a sugar is going to be stored chemical energy. Okay. So again, it's going to be stored as sugar, which is stored chemical energy. ATP is also stored chemical energy, but the energy is more readily accessible by the cell than sugar is. All right. So to summarize, here are the two formulas. Cellular respiration is sugar plus oxygen yields ATP, CO2, and water. Photosynthesis is CO2 and water yielding sugar and oxygen using sunlight as an energy source to break up the water into hydrogen and oxygen to be added to the CO2. So it might be helpful. There's not necessarily a spot on your notes to draw this this formula by itself. It might be helpful to put this onto a flashcard just to kind of have it to as a quick reference for this for these notes. So that is where we will stop